Chapter 7, creating the world of the play. And you might ask yourself, who is creating the world of the play? And that would be the playwright. And notice the way this term is spelled, W-R-I-G-H-T. That suffix specifically denotes a person who is a craftsperson. You can see the definition here from the American Heritage Dictionary, one that constructs or repairs something, often used in combinations such as playwright, shipwright, cartwright, wainwright, etc. So right denotes a craftsperson, somebody who makes things. And in this case, the playwright crafts or constructs the world of the play. Now I have a short video here that we'll be watching, and this is included on eCollege, so you can always go back and look at it later, called Rob Handel on Playwriting. And Rob Handel interviews several playwrights and asks them why they do what they do, what they feel about playwriting, and so we'll go ahead and watch that now.
A playwright for me would be a person who illuminates human behavior in a way that makes us all feel connected.
The most important thing about playwriting is this. When you write a play, it's totally different than writing a book or writing a poem, because it's not meant to be read. It's not meant to be experienced by someone alone with a page. It's a blueprint for something that's going to happen. It's sort of like a game plan for a football game on a blackboard, where you say, okay, now this person's going to move over there, and they're going to say, I love you, I've always loved you, and then this person will move over there and say, don't say this to me, I'm married to someone else, and then run out the door. And so you're writing out a plan for all these things that are going to happen in time. It's more like a piece of music, really, than a piece of writing. And playwriting, I think, is creating a world that you can actually find yourself in the black box, where the walls disappear, the audience disappears, and you're actually in that world, and you believe it, and it could be completely absurd and bizarre. And the more absurd and bizarre, to me, the more enjoyable it is, because the writer is taking you someplace, and it's giving you all the information that you need to believe what you're seeing. And it takes very little effort, or no effort at all, to suspend your disbelief.
My ideal about being a writer, or generally being this kind of business, is the notion that you hang out with smart, intelligent people who will push you, make you have interesting thoughts.
I write plays because I like talking to people. My grandmother used to say I could talk the leg off a chair. And I enjoy hearing people's stories. Very much enjoy sharing stories with people. And for me, plays are an immediate way of doing that. A novel isn't. A nonfiction book isn't. You know there are people out there enjoying it because you'll get letters from them. It's not the same as sitting in an audience or walking outside after a play is over and hearing feedback right away.
And I think it's about great moments, and that every moment should be alive and electric and captivating and interesting.
Well, that's what makes theater different from like TV or film, because you're disconnected from TV or film. You're just kind of like, you're just watching it. You're just, that's all you're doing. It doesn't really force you to think. But like every performance of a play is completely different. You know, each audience really gets their own vibe going. And the writing process is very exciting. It's a very, like any writing, it's very internal. And I think for any writer, it is very exciting in your own head to sit there and figure things out and listen to the characters and get excited by what they're saying. You know, and that's a very internal thing, but it is very satisfying.
The secret to good playwriting for me is passion. You have to be passionate about your characters, or your story, and your audience. If you are not passionate about your audience, I don't think you can write plays.
The most important quality in playwriting for me is that there's a lot of openness to it, that it asks questions rather than makes statements, that you leave a play and you have an argument with the people you saw the play with about whether the hero did the right thing or the wrong thing.
I wouldn't be able to say what drives me as a writer other than the fact that, I just have to do it. I think there are certain people where, I've always written, and, if I didn't right. You know, I think it would be really bad.
I think some of the best things you're ever going to experience in an artistic, in your artistic life, you're going to see them here.
And whether it's comedy or drama, your protagonist is generally going to be flawed, because we are flawed. So when we see this character that is flawed, but that changes and grows nonetheless, in fact, because of those flaws, often, it makes us feel like we are capable of change and transformation. I think that's the beauty of art.
So some things to notice about that video. The first playwright mentions that he felt that plays illuminate human behavior. Remember, all plays are about humans and human conflict, so that would be in keeping with what we've learned. Secondly, plays aren't meant to be read, to be experienced by someone alone with the page. It's a blueprint of something that is going to happen. So plays are always group experiences, and scripts themselves are meant to be performed. So while we read scripts in class, and while you will read and we will discuss the Glass Menagerie during this unit, this script wasn't written with the idea that it would be inflicted upon a bunch of theater and English students in college, that they would have to read it. The idea was, Tennessee Williams originally wrote this to be performed, to be a play performed on stage. So the script is just a blueprint, a way to get ideas across and to get the ball rolling towards that final product, which is a fully realized production. Third, you have to suspend your disbelief. Suspension of disbelief is very important in theater, the idea that we have to use our imagination and fill in the blanks, more so than in other forms of entertainment like television and film. And then finally, you're disconnected from TV or film. You're just watching it. Every performance of a play is completely different. Each audience gets its own vibe going because of that performer-audience relationship and because it is live theater. Every production begins with a story, and traditionally it is the playwright who determines and tells that story by writing the script, such as Tennessee Williams' Glass Menagerie, as I mentioned. We will be reading and talking about this play more in depth this unit, so make sure you do have that read and you're prepared to think about it a little more deeply, because we will analyze it. Within the script itself is also included the blocking and the dialogue. And the blocking is the movement and the positions of the actors on stage. And so that is partially determined by the playwright within the script and partially by the actors and the director. And in fact, if you flip open to pretty much any page of a script, you'll notice occasionally there are italicized portions of the script. And often that is blocking or more details about what's going on in the background or the scenery, etc. So for example, it says Tom, so on page 23, Tom, and then in brackets, italicized, wildly. No, I'm in no condition. So that gives you an impression of how he's supposed to be saying that. Later on, Tom says, listen, you think I'm crazy about the warehouse? And then in italics, he bends fiercely toward her slight figure. So that would be the blocking, what he's physically doing on stage at that moment. So some of that is determined by the play script, and some of that is determined by the director and the actors when it's not in the script already. The purpose of the play is also contained within the script. So the playwright is determining why they're telling this story and what the purpose of it would be. And so some examples of purposes might be to move the audience, to make them feel something, to educate them about something they might not have had knowledge of before, to inform or maybe persuade them toward a certain point of view, to entertain them, to inspire them, maybe to do something, maybe even to affect change. So it can have some social significance and connotations as well. The playwright also determines theme, space, time, and character. And these four characteristics shape the story and how that story is told. And so the playwright has direct control over these four. So let's begin with theme, which is what the play is about. So theme is what a play is about, not to be confused with genre, which is what type of play it is, or plot, which is what occurs within the play. So a genre, for example, might be musical theater or children's theater or comedy or tragedy. These are all different genres or types. what those individual plays are about at their heart, if you have to boil them down, that would be considered their theme. And plays can have multiple themes, so one play can have several themes, and in fact, the theme has to often be determined by the viewer or by the director or the actors, the designers. They have to devise and figure out what themes they think are important, and that should be highlighted in their production of the script. So theme is what the play is about at its heart, and some popular themes include things like love or hate. We love to see stories that we can relate to, and everyone's been in love or disliked somebody, so these are very common themes. Revenge, power struggles, family and family dysfunction, again, a universal theme. We all have families. Most of our families probably have some sort of dysfunction in them, and so we find that entertaining to see the conflict that arises in family dysfunction, because we can see ourselves and we can equate ourselves with what's going on. They can also be morals, so as in children's stories or fables, often the theme boils down to a moral. So like in The Three Little Pigs, hard work will lead to favorable outcomes. So the first two pigs built their houses kind of sloppily out of straw or sticks, and then the third one invested a lot of time and effort and made it out of brick and stone, and so it was very strong, and it withstood the big bad wolf at the end. So that is the moral of the story, and that would be one of the themes of the story. The playwright also determines space, and space can have two connotations: physical versus metaphorical space. And in physical space, we're referring to the place in which the play is actually occurring, where you're physically sitting and watching the play. And this can also be referred to as the venue. So for example, if you went to see The Glass Menagerie at the Dallas Theater Center, that would be the venue or physical space. So you know you're actually physically in the Dallas Theater Center. And scripts can sometimes determine the appropriate venue. If you write a play that requires 20 kick-line girls dancing across the stage, well, a very tiny stage would not be appropriate for that. So that sort of play would be more appropriate for a large proscenium space and a bigger theater space that would allow all those women to traipse across the stage. Metaphorical space is the space within the play. So physical space is where you actually are seated watching the play. Metaphorical space is the space we are in within the play, so where you are in your imagination. And there's a good quote on page 159 that says, "The action of a play," and this is at the top, "is generally confined to a world of its own, that is, to a fictional universe which contains all the characters and events of the play." So that metaphorical space is often the setting where we are in the world of the play. So it could be in a castle, it could be on the moon, it could be in Spain, it could be wherever the playwright has decided to set it. And in some cases, the director can choose to change the metaphorical space, the setting. And that happens a lot with like Shakespeare plays. They get updated to more modern settings or modern periods so that the audience can better understand what's going on or better relate to the themes within the play. Time also has two connotations: physical and metaphorical time. Physical time refers specifically to the running time, so how long it takes to tell the story, how long you're actually seated in the physical space watching the play. And so the running time of a play is usually about 1.5 to 2 hours long. Now some plays run longer. I mentioned Shakespeare. A lot of Shakespeare plays will run 3-4 hours if you do them from beginning to end without cutting them. But again, a lot of directors will choose to cut those plays, take scenes out or lines out to shorten it and try to get it closer to that 2-hour time frame, because modern audiences really prefer plays to be under 2 hours. We've kind of gotten used to movies and television shows running about an hour, hour and a half or so. So 2 hours is about the stretching it. That's about as much as you can expect a modern audience to stay engaged, to not have to get up and pee or get a drink or whatever. So these older plays can be altered, can be set in different periods or set in different places because they are a part of the public domain. Nobody owns the rights to them. You do not have to pay royalties to perform them, and thus you don't have to get anyone's permission to change them. The physical time, the running time, can be impacted by how many scenes there are. So the playwright is directly impacting the running time. And then also how many intermissions are included. And an intermission is usually about halfway through the play. And it's usually very clear. The lights come up and then everybody can go out and again get a drink, use the restroom, what have you. And then you come back for the second half of the play. Long plays sometimes have 2 intermissions. So you might have Act 1 and an intermission, Act 2 and an intermission, and then the final act, Act 3. But those would be extremely long plays. Again, 2 hours or more might require 2 intermissions. The metaphorical time in a play can be referred to in 2 ways, or thought of in 2 ways. Either as the period in which the play is set, so for example the 1800s, 1950, modern day, so wherever we're supposed to be in time in the story. And then also the time elapsed within the story. The metaphorical time can refer to that as well. So for example, Rip Van Winkle, in his story, he falls asleep, 100 years pass, he wakes up, and then the story continues, and we see how that unfolds for him. So the elapsed metaphorical time within this play or this story would be 100 years. Now luckily, the physical time is not 100 years. You don't have to sit there for 100 years and watch all of this unfold. Instead, they have some sort of flash forward or some other conceit that allows us to push forward in time. And that happens a lot in plays. In fact, in The Glass Menagerie, you'll notice that we actually have at least a few weeks, maybe even a couple of months of elapsed time in here. We go from wearing jackets to talking about spring and summer coming. So it's at least a chilly spring and moving into a late spring at the very least. So we do have some elapsed time in between the scenes. So stuff has happened that we do not see. Alright, so we've talked about time, we've talked about space and theme. The fourth characteristic that the playwright directly influences are the characters, and the characters are very important because that is who is telling us the stories. So the actors are portraying the characters on stage. And since all plays contain conflict, usually these 2 conflicting sides in a story are called the protagonist and the antagonist, and they're in direct conflict with each other. And so there's been kind of a misnomer. Sometimes you will hear the word protagonist referred to as the good guy, and that's not necessarily true. The protagonist is actually the main character within the story, and it can be a good guy, could be a bad guy, could be somebody in the gray area in between, but it's the main character, so everything's happening to them, or they're driving the action, or they're telling the story, so they're a main character. The antagonist is in opposition to the main character, so creating the conflict, the obstacles that the protagonist has to overcome, and not necessarily a good or bad guy character either. So protagonist is main character, antagonist is in opposition to the main character. And I'm sure you can think of shows or movies where the main character is a bad guy or a bad person, and he would still be the protagonist. The example I've given you here is that TV show Breaking Bad, where the main character is a science teacher who eventually becomes a meth cook and a meth dealer, and he does all sorts of terrible things by the end of his story arc. And he starts out not such a bad guy, somebody you could relate to, and by the end he's killing people and dissolving their bodies in vats of acid. So he becomes very much a bad guy, but he's still the protagonist, the main character. And the antagonists in opposition to him very often are good guy type characters like the feds and the DEA and people that are trying to catch him and stop him. So the protagonist, not necessarily a good guy, antagonist, not necessarily a bad guy character. We have some excellent images on pages 160 to 163 of characters in opposition to each other. Here we have Othello and Iago, and over here we've got King Lear and one of his daughters, and you can see that these are very much very emotional, high tension situations and conflict, and you have sets of protagonists and antagonists, in the story and conflict. And then the next 2 pages we've got down here Romeo and Juliet, and then over here we've got Hamlet and his uncle Claudius, who he's trying to kill, but he decides not to, because if he does, Claudius, who has killed his father, he's trying to get revenge for his father, is praying, and so he will be absolved of his sins and he will go to heaven, and Hamlet definitely doesn't want that. So a very tense moment in the play where the protagonist and the antagonist are in direct conflict. And then over here we actually have physical conflict between two characters in Romeo and Juliet. Sword fighting, physical conflict, not unusual in Shakespeare plays. All right, the book goes on page 162 to explain the difference between story and plot. And these are terms that are often used interchangeably, and I make that mistake myself a lot, talking about the story that the playwright's telling. Well, the playwright's actually crafted the plot, and the plot comes from the story. So, for example, the story is a narrative account of total events in chronological order, so everything that happens. And then plot is where you take bits and pieces of that story and then dramatize it on stage. So, for example, if we take Abraham Lincoln's life, his story would be his entire life, from when he's born to when he dies, and every little teeny tiny thing in between. So that's his story, everything told in chronological order. The plot, if we were going to dramatize this and make it a play, would be the bits and pieces we decide to pull out and show on stage. So we'd probably just take the most important or exciting stuff, like his birth, and then maybe an episode from his youth, and then showing him becoming a lawyer, getting married, entering politics, etc., etc. So we take all the bits and pieces that we thought were important, and we would show those on stage. We would dramatize them on stage. So that would be the plot. The plot comes from the story, and the story is an entire sequence of events told chronologically. The playwright also determines the structure of the play, how it's told, what form it takes, what shape it takes. So typical dramatic structure looks something like this, and this might be familiar from English class, having to diagram stories. Typical dramatic structure begins with exposition, and exposition is the introduction to the story, where we find out who the characters are, maybe where we are and when we are, so we get the basics of the story. After the exposition, we have the rising action, which are all of the events that begin to occur. So that's really when things get interesting, when the protagonist and the antagonist come in conflict, and things really start to heat up. At some point in the story, we have the climax, which is the point of no return. It's the point at which the character's fate might be sealed. It might also be the point of highest tension. So if you think of the story as maybe a TV show, that's probably where they're going to put the commercial, because they want you to come back and find out what's going to happen. So it can contain a cliffhanger type moment. And the following action is everything that occurs after or because of the climactic action, the climax. And then finally we have what's called the denouement, which is a French word meaning the ending of the story, the wrapping up of the story. So this is very typical dramatic structure. Not all stories follow this structure to the letter. In fact, some stories you could probably think of don't have much exposition, like action movies. They often throw you into a scene and people are running and there's explosions and guns, and you don't really know what's happening at first, and then slowly you kind of learn who these characters are and what's going on. So sometimes the exposition is embedded in the rising action like that, and we just get it in bits and pieces. We don't get it neatly told to us at the beginning. And sometimes there's not a lot of denouement as well. Some stories don't have a lot of wrapping up. We might not find out everything that happens to the main characters. So this is just a very simple dramatic structure. But you will find that children's fables, children's stories, simple stories often follow this structure pretty closely because they follow a very simple model. Other stories for adults, things that are more complicated, the model might be slightly different. So if we take a story like The Three Little Pigs, which I mentioned earlier, the exposition is usually at the very beginning. Once upon a time there were three little pigs, blah, blah, blah. So in stories and fairy tales, often we get it at the very, very beginning. When we talk about The Glass Menagerie, you'll notice we actually have a narrator who gives us the exposition, tells us who everyone is and what's going on at the very top of the play in the first scene. So after the exposition, we have the rising action. The first little pig builds his house out of straw. The big bad wolf comes and blows threatens to blow his house down. So that would be the rising action. Climax, the big bad wolf huffs and puffs, blows the straw house down. falling action, the first little pig runs to his brother's house of sticks. And then we actually repeat the rising action and climax and falling action again with the next pig, and then the rising action and climax again with the third pig, until obviously the wolf can't blow it down, and then he runs away, or he gets boiled in a pot, depending on the version of the story that you're reading. So that would be the final falling action, and then the denouement would be they lived happily ever after, and they all built strong houses that could withstand wolves or what have you. So in fairy tales, we often have a really strong dramatic structure, and it can be a little more obvious. In other stories, it can be a little more difficult to determine what the structure is.